If you sign this, you won't have to worry about money ever again. Ethan Caldwell said without looking up, his voice calm, measured, as if he were discussing stock prices instead of a human life. The rain tapping softly against the 40th floor glass behind him, each drop tracing slow paths down the skyline of Manhattan, and across from him, Amara Brooks didn't move right away. She sat still in the leather chair, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the contract, her reflection faintly visible in the polished table, a woman who didn't belong in this room by every standard Ethan had ever known. And yet she didn't shrink under it. The silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional, not awkward, not uncertain, but chosen. And that was the first thing that unsettled him, because people usually filled silence around him. They rushed to impress, to justify, to explain, but she didn't. She simply read, line by line, steady, focused, as if the numbers and clauses meant less than something else only she could see. 2 years, she said finally, her voice soft but clear, not asking, not negotiating, just confirming. And Ethan leaned back slightly, studying her for the first time, really studying her, the calm in her posture, the way her shoulders stayed relaxed, the absence of desperation he had expected to see. 2 years, he repeated, his tone sharpening just a fraction. Public appearances, shared residence, no emotional involvement. And when it ends, we walk away clean. He slid a pen across the table toward her, a sleek black instrument worth more than most people's monthly rent. It's simple, he added, though nothing about the way she looked at him felt simple anymore. Amara picked up the pen, but instead of signing, she met his eyes, and there was something there, not defiance, not fear, something steadier, something that didn't bend. And if I refuse, she asked. And for the first time in the meeting, Ethan paused, just for a second, because people didn't usually ask that question, not when they were sitting where she was sitting, not when they had what she had to gain. Then you walk out that door, he said, gesturing slightly toward the hallway. And nothing changes. But even as he said it, he realized something had already shifted, something small but undeniable, like a crack you only notice once the light hits it just right. Amara nodded once, as if she had expected that answer, then looked back down at the contract, her thumb brushing lightly over the paper, not hesitating, just acknowledging. And then she signed, her handwriting clean, deliberate, no flourish, no pause, just a decision made without performance. She slid the contract back toward him, and the sound of paper against wood felt louder than it should have. Done, she said, and stood, smoothing the sleeve of her jacket as if this were just another ordinary agreement, another ordinary day. And Ethan watched her, something unfamiliar tightening in his chest, not doubt, not regret, something closer to curiosity, the kind he usually reserved for markets and strategies, not people. You'll move in tomorrow, he said, regaining his usual tone, his usual control, but she was already turning toward the door. I'll be there, she replied without looking back. And as the door clicked shut behind her, the penthouse felt strangely quieter, the rain louder, the city further away, and Ethan stared at the signature at the bottom of the page, Amara Brooks, simple, unremarkable ink on expensive paper. And yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just agreed to something far more complicated than a contract, something he couldn't calculate, couldn't predict. And for a man who built his entire life on control, that was the one thing he never allowed. But it was already too late, because somewhere between the silence, the pen, and the way she never once tried to impress him, she had already done something no one else had managed in years. She had made him look twice. The next morning arrived without ceremony, just pale sunlight slipping between the glass towers of Manhattan and stretching across the polished floors of Ethan Caldwell's penthouse. And for the first time in years, something about that space felt observed, as if it were no longer entirely his. The elevator chimed softly at exactly 9 o'clock, not a second early, not a second late. And when the doors opened, Amara Brooks stepped out carrying a single suitcase. Nothing excessive, nothing designed to impress, just enough. And that alone made Ethan pause from across the room where he stood reviewing emails on his tablet. Most people who entered his world tried to match it, to dress louder, speak faster, fill the silence with something that proved they belonged. But she did none of that. She simply walked in, calm, composed, her eyes briefly scanning the space before settling on Him, not in awe, not in discomfort, just acknowledgement. You are on time, Ethan said, setting the tablet down slowly, his tone neutral, but his gaze sharper than before, measuring, calculating, searching for something he could define, and she gave a small nod, placing her suitcase neatly beside the wall, as if she had already decided where it belonged. You said 9, she replied, and there was no attempt to impress him in her voice, no effort to soften the statement, just fact. He gestured lightly toward the hallway. Your room is down the left corridor. Everything you need has been arranged. And she followed the direction without question, without curiosity, without that subtle hesitation most people showed when stepping into unfamiliar luxury, as if comfort was not something she needed to negotiate. Ethan watched her go, his jaw tightening slightly, not in irritation, but in something more unfamiliar, something closer to displacement, because this was supposed to be simple, controlled, predictable, and yet her presence shifted the atmosphere in a way he could not measure. By the time she returned 10 minutes later, the suitcase was gone, unpacked somewhere behind closed doors, and she stood again in front of him as if nothing had changed. Is there a schedule? She asked, and Ethan blinked once, caught off guard by the question, because no one had ever asked that before, not like this, not without hesitation. There will be events, he said, regaining his rhythm. Public appearances, dinners, meetings where your presence is required. He stepped closer, his voice lowering slightly, more controlled. You do not need to speak unless addressed, and when you are, keep it brief. And for a moment, the room seemed to tighten around that instruction, but Amara only held his gaze, steady, unshaken. Understood, she said. And again, there was no resistance, but there was also no submission, just agreement on terms. The first test came sooner than he expected, that same evening. A private dinner hosted on the Upper East Side, the kind of gathering where every detail was curated and every guest measured against invisible standards. And as they entered together, heads turned, quiet whispers weaving through the room like threads pulled too tight, eyes lingering just a second longer on Amara, assessing, questioning, dismissing, and Ethan felt it immediately, the shift in attention, the subtle judgment that always followed him but now carried something else. Something sharper, because of her. He expected discomfort, a flicker of hesitation, anything that would confirm the imbalance he had designed into this arrangement. But instead, Amara moved beside him. With the same calm precision she had shown that morning, her posture straight, her expression composed, her silence not empty but intentional. And when a woman across the room let out a soft, amused laugh, just loud enough to be heard. Interesting choice, she murmured to her companion. Amara did not react, not even a glance, and that absence of reaction rippled through the room in a way no response could have, leaving the comment hanging without power. Ethan noticed it instantly, the way people shifted, the way their curiosity sharpened instead of fading, and for the first time, he realized something unexpected. This was not going to unfold the way he had planned, because the woman standing beside him was not playing the role he had written for her. She was rewriting it without saying a single word. The laughter did not linger, but the echo of it stayed in the air long enough to test everyone in the room, and Ethan felt it like a shift in temperature, subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that usually made people adjust, correct themselves, retreat into something safer. But when he glanced at Amara, she had not moved, not even a fraction, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady ahead, as if the moment had already passed before it even began, and that unsettled him more than the comment itself ever could. The dinner unfolded with the quiet precision of high society, crystal glasses catching the warm glow of chandeliers, voices layered in careful politeness, every sentence carrying weight beneath its surface, and Ethan moved through it as he always did, controlled, respected, untouchable. But now there was a second presence beside him that drew attention in a different way, not loud, not demanding, but impossible to ignore. And he noticed how conversations shifted when Amara stood near, how people paused just a second longer before speaking, how their eyes flickered toward her as if trying to understand something they could not immediately define. Midway through the evening, a man approached, someone Ethan recognized instantly, a senior investor known for his measured tone and sharper opinions. Ethan, he greeted with a polite nod before his gaze slid briefly toward Amara, lingering just long enough to feel intentional. "You have not introduced us." And there it was, the moment Ethan had anticipated, the moment that would reveal whether this arrangement would hold its structure or fracture under expectation. And for a split second, he considered speaking first, controlling the narrative as he always did, but Amara turned slightly before he could, her expression composed, her voice calm and clear. "Amara Brooks," she said, extending her hand. With quiet confidence, not too eager, not hesitant, just exact, and the man blinked, surprised, not by her name, but by the way she delivered it, as if she had nothing to prove and no reason to diminish herself. And after a brief pause, he took her hand. "Pleasure," he replied, though his tone carried curiosity now instead of judgment. Ethan watched closely, expecting the conversation to falter, to reveal the imbalance he had built into this situation, but it did not. Amara answered when addressed, her words precise, her tone measured, never overstepping, never retreating, and somehow that balance created something unexpected, not acceptance, not yet, but a disruption in the assumptions that had filled the room earlier. As the evening continued, Ethan found himself distracted, not by the deals being discussed or the subtle negotiations unfolding around him, but by the quiet pattern forming beside him, the way Amara navigated every interaction without effort, without performance, as if she understood the rules without needing to follow them too closely. And that realization unsettled him more than anything else, because it meant she was not reacting to his world, she was moving through it on her own terms. Later, as they stepped out onto the terrace where the city stretched below in a grid of lights and motion, the noise of the dinner softened behind them, replaced by the distant hum of traffic and the cool night air. Ethan finally spoke, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "You handled that differently than I expected." And Amara rested her hands lightly against the railing, looking out over the skyline instead of at him. "You expected me to react," she said simply, and he did not deny it, because it was true. He had expected discomfort, defensiveness, something that confirmed his control over the situation, but she had given him none of it. "Most people would," he replied after a moment, and she turned her head slightly, her expression thoughtful, not confrontational. "Most people are trying to prove something," she said. "I am not." And the words settled between them with a weight that did not need emphasis, because for the first time, Ethan realized something he had not accounted for. This was not a negotiation he could win by setting terms, not a role he could define by rules, because the person standing beside him was not playing along in the way he had planned. And as he looked at her, really looked this time, he felt that unfamiliar shift again, stronger now, deeper, something that moved past curiosity into something far more dangerous for a man like him, something that felt like the beginning of losing control, even though the contract was still perfectly intact. The ride back to the penthouse was silent, but it was not the comfortable silence Ethan was used to, not the kind that came from control or completion. It was something heavier, something unsettled, like a question that refused to form into words. And as the black car moved through the late-night traffic, reflections of passing streetlights slid across the window, briefly illuminating Amara's face before fading again, and each time, her expression remained the same, calm, distant, unreadable. Ethan finally broke the silence, his voice low, measured. "You did not need to speak first tonight." And although his tone sounded neutral, there was a subtle edge beneath it, not anger, not quite, but something closer to discomfort, the kind that came from something not going according to expectation. Amara turned her head slightly, her gaze steady but not confrontational. "He asked." She replied simply, and that answer, so direct, so unembellished, lingered longer than it should have, because it left no room for interpretation, no space for him to reshape it into something else. Ethan exhaled quietly, leaning back against the leather seat, his fingers tapping once against his knee before going still. "There are expectations in those rooms," he said, choosing his words carefully, unspoken ones. And for a moment, the city lights reflected in his eyes as if he were looking at something far beyond the glass, something internal, something he had followed for so long it no longer felt like a choice. Amara considered that, her gaze drifting back toward the window, watching the blurred motion of the city as it passed. I noticed, she said, and there was no bitterness in her voice, no trace of offense, just acknowledgement, and somehow that made the statement carry more weight than any reaction would have. When they arrived, the elevator ride to the penthouse felt shorter than usual, or perhaps just quieter, and as the doors opened, the familiar stillness of the space welcomed them back, but it did not feel the same as it had the night before. Something subtle had shifted, something neither of them addressed. Ethan loosened his jacket as he stepped inside, setting it carefully over the back of a chair, his movements precise, controlled, but there was a tension in them now, a slight delay between intention and action, as if his mind was elsewhere, replaying something he could not quite resolve. Amara moved past him without hesitation, heading toward the kitchen, and for a brief moment, he watched her, not because he needed to, but because he found himself doing it without deciding to. And when she reached for a glass, filling it with water as if she had always known where everything was, it struck him again, that quiet sense of displacement, as if she was not adjusting to his world, but existing within it without permission. You are not curious? He asked suddenly, the question leaving his mouth before he could filter it, and she paused, the glass in her hand catching the soft overhead light. About what? She asked, turning slightly, and Ethan hesitated, because he realized he did not know how to phrase it, not in a way that made sense even to himself. About any of this, he said finally, gesturing vaguely to the space around them, the penthouse, the city beyond, the life he had built, most people would be. And Amara studied him for a moment, not analyzing, not judging, just observing, and then she took a slow sip of water before answering. Curiosity changes nothing, she said, setting the glass down gently against the counter, the sound soft but deliberate. Understanding does, and for a second, the room felt still, as if even the air had paused to hold the words in place. Ethan frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in thought, because the distinction she made was not one he was used to considering. His world had always been built on anticipation, calculation, knowing what came next before it happened, but what she described was something different, something that did not fit neatly into strategy. And you think you understand this? He asked, his tone quieter now, less certain than before, and Amara met his gaze fully this time, her expression steady, unshaken. I understand that it is temporary, she said. And there it was, the boundary, spoken without hesitation, without emotion, just truth. And something about the way she said it settled into him deeper than expected, because it reminded him of the one thing he had designed into this arrangement from the very beginning, the one thing that made it safe, made it controlled, made it predictable, and yet hearing it from her made it feel different, less like a rule and more like a reality he had not fully considered. Ethan looked away first, his jaw tightening slightly as he turned toward the window, the city stretching out beneath him in endless lines of light, and for the first time since the contract had been signed, he felt something unfamiliar press quietly against the edges of his control, not enough to break it, not yet, but enough to make him aware that it was there, waiting, and as the silence returned, heavier now, more defined, he realized that whatever this arrangement was supposed to be, it was already becoming something else, something he could not easily name, and that uncertainty, more than anything else, was beginning to matter. The next morning did not announce itself with anything dramatic, just a thin line of sunlight cutting across the marble floor and the quiet hum of the city waking far below. But something in the air felt different, not louder, not heavier, just aware, as if the space itself had begun to adjust to a presence it had not expected to keep. Ethan was already awake, standing by the window with a cup of coffee that had long since gone untouched, his reflection faint against the glass, his mind moving through numbers, schedules, projections, the familiar rhythm that had built his world. But it was interrupted, subtly at first, by the sound of footsteps behind him, steady, unhurried, and he did not turn right away, because part of him already knew who it was, and part of him did not want to acknowledge how quickly that recognition had become instinct. You wake early, Amara said, her voice calm as she moved into the kitchen, reaching for a mug without hesitation, as if she had memorized the layout overnight, and Ethan exhaled slowly, setting the coffee aside. I do not sleep much, he replied, his tone even, though there was something quieter beneath it, something less rehearsed than usual, and she nodded slightly, as if that answered more than the words themselves. The morning continued in that same quiet rhythm, not forced, not coordinated, just two people moving through the same space without colliding, without adjusting too much, and that in itself felt unusual to Ethan, because his life had always required others to adapt to him, to his pace, his expectations, his structure, but Amara did not seem to shift at all. She simply existed alongside it, unaffected. Later that day, the next event arrived, not as formal as the previous evening, but no less significant. A midday meeting at one of Ethan's corporate offices, a place defined by glass walls, polished surfaces, and the constant movement of people who knew exactly where they belonged. And as they entered together, the reaction was immediate, not loud, not obvious, but present in the way conversations paused, in the way glances were exchanged just quickly enough to pretend they were not, and Ethan felt it again, that subtle shift in perception. But this time, something else layered beneath it, something closer to anticipation. They moved through the office floor with purpose, Ethan leading, Amara beside him. And when they reached the conference room, a group of executives already waited, their attention snapping into focus as he entered, but it lingered, just briefly, on her, measuring, assessing, recalibrating expectations in real time. And Ethan noticed how they adjusted their posture, their tone, their words, trying to align with a situation they had not been prepared for. The meeting began as expected, numbers discussed, strategies outlined, voices controlled and deliberate. But midway through, something shifted, a discrepancy in a report, small at first glance, but enough to slow the momentum of the room, and Ethan's gaze narrowed slightly as he reviewed the figures again, his mind already moving toward resolution. But before he could speak, Amara leaned forward just slightly, her voice cutting through the quiet without raising in volume. That projection assumes a fixed cost increase across all divisions, she said, her tone steady, not challenging, just precise, and the room stilled, every eye turning toward her, not in disbelief, but in sudden attention. Ethan looked at her, surprised not by the observation itself, but by the timing, the clarity, the way she had stepped in without hesitation, without seeking permission, and for a moment, no one spoke, the silence stretching as the numbers were reconsidered, recalculated, and then one of the executives cleared his throat softly. "She is right," he admitted, adjusting the document in front of him. And just like that, the entire direction of the discussion shifted, not dramatically, but enough to matter. Ethan said nothing, but his gaze remained on her for a second longer than necessary, because this was not part of the arrangement, not part of the role he had defined, and yet she had stepped into it as if it belonged to her, not forcefully, not disruptively, just naturally, and that unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain. As the meeting concluded and the room began to empty, one by one, the executives offering polite nods, respectful acknowledgments, something else lingered in the air, something quieter but more significant. And as Ethan and Amara stepped back into the hallway, he finally spoke, his voice lower now, more measured than before. "That was not necessary," he said, though there was no accusation in it, only observation, and Amara met his gaze without hesitation. "It was correct," she replied, and again, the simplicity of her answer carried more weight than anything else could have, because it did not defend, did not justify, it simply existed, and for the first time, Ethan realized that the boundaries he had drawn so carefully were not being broken, they were being redefined, not by force, not by resistance, but by something far more difficult to control, something he could not reduce to terms or conditions, something that was beginning to matter in ways he had not intended. And as they continued down the corridor, the quiet between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like something building, something neither of them named, but both of them had started to feel. The elevator doors closed behind them with a soft, precise sound, sealing in the quiet that followed the meeting, and for a moment neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because something had shifted again, something subtle but undeniable, like a line that had moved without either of them acknowledging it out loud. Ethan stood with his hands loosely at his sides, his posture composed as always, but his mind was not on the next meeting, Not on the emails waiting. It was on her, on the way she had stepped into that room and altered its direction without hesitation, without permission, and more importantly, without needing approval afterward. And that was what unsettled him most. Not the action itself, but the absence of expectation that followed it. When the elevator reached the top floor and opened into the quiet expanse of the penthouse, the city stretched beyond the windows in a wash of late afternoon light. The skyline softened by distance, and Amara moved ahead first this time, setting her bag down near the entry before walking toward the kitchen, her steps steady, unhurried, as if the weight of what had just happened had already settled for her, while for him, it had not. "You assumed a lot in there," Ethan said finally, his voice calm but carrying a sharper edge beneath it. Not quite criticism, but not entirely neutral either, and she paused, turning slightly to face him, her expression unchanged. "I did not assume," she replied, her tone even. "I observed." And again, that difference, that precise distinction, landed heavier than it should have, because it meant something he had not considered, something outside the framework he had built. Ethan took a step closer, his gaze focused now, searching for something that would bring the situation back into familiar ground. "This is not your responsibility," he said, more firmly this time, not raising his voice, but reinforcing a boundary he had set from the beginning. "You are here to fulfill a role," and the words lingered between them, structured, controlled, the kind of statement that usually ended conversations. But Amara did not look away, did not retreat. She simply held his gaze, steady, unshaken. "And I am," she said quietly. "I did exactly what was needed in that moment." And there was no defiance in her voice, no challenge, just clarity, and that clarity made it harder to dismiss. Ethan exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening just enough to reveal the tension he rarely allowed to surface, because this was not how things worked, not in his world, not under his control. And yet every time she spoke, every time she acted, she shifted that structure just enough to make it feel less certain. He turned away for a moment, running a hand lightly along the edge of the counter as if grounding himself in something solid, something predictable, but even that felt different now, as if the space itself no longer belonged entirely to him. "You are changing the dynamic," he said finally, quieter now, more reflective than before, and when he turned back, she was still watching him, not with intensity, not with judgment, just awareness. "No," she replied. "It is already changing." And the words settled into the room with a quiet finality that neither of them could ignore. Outside, the light had begun to fade, the city shifting into evening, each building lighting up one window at a time, a pattern that repeated itself every day without question, without hesitation, and Ethan found himself looking toward it, towards something that remained consistent, something that followed rules he understood, because inside, the rules were no longer holding the same way. "You think this lasts beyond the contract," he said after a moment, not turning back to her. "Not yet." And there was something in his tone now, something closer to uncertainty than he would ever admit, and behind him. Amara did not answer immediately. She let the silence sit. Let the question exist fully before responding. "I think," she said slowly, "that you are already asking the wrong question." And when he finally looked at her again, something in his expression had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone else, but enough to mark the moment, enough to signal that whatever this was supposed to be, whatever boundaries had been set, they were no longer as fixed as they had once seemed, and that realization, quiet as it was, carried more weight than anything that had happened so far, because it meant the one thing Ethan Caldwell had always relied on, his control, was no longer absolute, and for the first time, he was beginning to feel it slip. The evening settled slowly over the city, not with noise but with a quiet kind of weight, the kind that lingered in the corners of rooms and in the pauses between words and inside the penthouse. That weight had begun to take shape, subtle but present, as if something unseen had shifted just enough to be felt, but not yet fully understood. Ethan stood near the window again. The skyline stretched before him in endless grids of light, each building predictable, each pattern familiar, and yet his focus kept breaking, drifting back to something much closer, something inside the room rather than beyond it. Behind him, Amara moved through the space with the same quiet precision she had shown from the beginning. But now there was something different in the way Ethan noticed it, not as an observation, but as an awareness he could not turn off. The sound of her footsteps, the slight pause when she reached for a glass, the way she stood without filling the silence, all of it registering in a way it had not before. "You are thinking too much," she said, her voice calm, not intrusive, just present, and Ethan exhaled lightly, though he did not turn immediately. "That is what I do," he replied, his tone controlled, but less rigid than it had been even hours earlier, and when he finally looked at her, she was watching him with that same steady gaze, not analyzing, not pressing, just seeing, and that alone unsettled him more than any direct question could have. "No," she said quietly, "that is what you rely on." And the distinction landed with precision, because it shifted the meaning of everything he had built, everything he trusted, into something that suddenly felt less certain, less absolute. Ethan took a step closer, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if he were navigating something unfamiliar. "And what do you rely on?" he asked, not sharply, not defensively, but with something closer to genuine curiosity. And for a moment, Amara did not answer. She let the question sit. Let it exist fully before responding. "Clarity," she said finally, and the word itself was simple, but the way she said it carried weight, not as an idea, but as something lived, something practiced. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with that word, with the difference between what he knew and what she understood, and Ethan felt it settle into him in a way that did not resolve anything, but instead opened something else, something he could not immediately define. Later that night, as the city dimmed slightly and the penthouse lights softened, the space felt smaller, not physically, but in the way presence filled it. And when Ethan moved toward his study, he paused at the doorway, his hand resting briefly against the frame as if grounding himself, because for the first time in years, his routine felt disrupted, not by chaos, not by external pressure, but by something quieter, something internal. Across the room, Amara sat near the window, not working, not distracted, just still, her gaze directed outward but not lost in it. And for a moment, Ethan simply watched, not out of control, but out of something he could not ignore, something that had shifted from curiosity into awareness. And that awareness carried weight, because it meant he was no longer observing from a distance. He was involved, whether he intended to be or not. "You could have stayed silent today," he said finally, his voice lower now, more reflective than before, and she turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I could have," she agreed. And again, there was no defense, no justification, just acknowledgement, and that simplicity made the next question inevitable, even if he did not want it to be. "Then why did you not?" he asked, and this time, she did not look away, did not pause as long. "Because silence would have been easier," she said. And easier is not always correct. And the words settled into the room with a quiet certainty that made them difficult to ignore, because they were not directed at him, not explicitly, but they reflected something back at him all the same. Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, something shifting. Behind his expression, something less controlled than before, less certain, and when he finally looked away, it was not out of dismissal, but out of thought, because for the first time, he was not just reacting to her presence, he was beginning to reconsider his own. The night stretched on, quiet, steady, but beneath that stillness, something had begun to build, not dramatically, not visibly, but undeniably, a shift in perspective, in awareness, in something deeper than either of them had intended. And as Ethan stood there, caught between the world he understood and the one that was beginning to unfold in front of him, he realized something that unsettled him more than anything else so far. This was no longer just an arrangement to manage. It was something he was starting to feel, and that made it unpredictable in a way he had never allowed before. The following days did not arrive with dramatic change, but with something quieter, more persistent, like a slow shift in gravity that neither of them acknowledged directly, yet both began to move within. Ethan noticed it first in the absence of friction, in the way routines that had once been rigid now unfolded with an ease he had not planned. Meetings ran sharper, decisions came faster, and though he told himself it was coincidence, the pattern repeated too consistently to ignore. across from him. Amara remained unchanged on the surface, still composed, still measured, still existing without seeking space. And yet her presence had begun to alter the rhythm of everything around her. That morning, sunlight stretched across the dining table as Ethan reviewed a stack of reports, his attention moving line by line, precise, focused, but not fully anchored, because part of his awareness lingered elsewhere, tracking the quiet movement of Amara as she stepped into the room, setting a cup of coffee near his hand without interrupting, without announcement, just placing it there as if she had already understood something he had not said. He glanced at it briefly, then at her. "I did not ask for this," he said, not harshly, but with that familiar need to define boundaries, to place actions within reason, and she gave a small nod, not offended, not defensive. "I know," she replied, and turned away before the statement could become something more, leaving him with the coffee and the realization that the gesture had not been about instruction, but observation. Later that afternoon, a different kind of tension surfaced, not from within the penthouse, but from outside it. A call that came through with a tone Ethan recognized instantly, controlled urgency masked beneath professional calm, and as he listened, his expression shifted, subtly but clearly, the lines of certainty tightening into something more focused, more alert. When he ended the call, the silence in the room felt different, heavier, and Amara, who had been standing near the window, turned slightly, not asking, not intruding, but aware. "There is a problem," Ethan said, his voice measured but carrying an edge he rarely allowed to show. "A partner firm is reconsidering an agreement." And though the words sounded controlled, the implication beneath them carried weight. Not immediate loss, but potential disruption, the kind that rippled through systems carefully built. Amara did not respond right away. She let the information settle, let the space hold it before stepping closer. "Reconsidering or withdrawing?" she asked, and the distinction was small, but precise, and Ethan noticed it immediately. "Reconsidering," he replied, his gaze narrowing slightly. "For now." And she nodded once, as if confirming something internally, not reacting to the tension, not amplifying it, just aligning with it. "Then they are uncertain," she said, and the statement was simple, but it reframed the situation in a way that shifted the weight of it, because uncertainty could be influenced, redirected, not something fixed, not something final. Ethan watched her for a moment, the familiar instinct to analyze rising again, but this time it was different, less about control, more about understanding. "You think that matters?" he asked, and she met his gaze, steady as always. "It always matters," she replied, and there was something in her tone, not confidence, not assumption, something quieter, something grounded in clarity rather than projection. The room held that exchange for a moment longer before Ethan turned slightly, his mind already moving through possibilities, but now with a different angle, a shift he could not fully trace back to logic alone. "There is a meeting tomorrow," he said, more to himself than to her. "They will expect a response." And Amara nodded, not stepping forward, not offering more than what was needed. "Then give them one," she said. And though the words were simple, the way she said them carried weight, not instruction, not pressure, just a reminder that the next step existed, waiting to be taken. As the evening settled again, the city lights returning in their familiar pattern, Ethan found himself standing still longer than usual, not because he lacked direction, but because something within that direction had shifted, subtly but significantly. And as he glanced toward Amara, who had returned to her place near the window, her presence steady, unchanged, he realized that whatever this situation was becoming, it was no longer defined solely by the contract he had written. It was being shaped by something else, something quieter, something that did not announce itself, but made itself known all the same. And that realization stayed with him longer than the problem he had been given, because for the first time, he was not just preparing to respond, he was beginning to consider how her presence had already changed the way he would. The next morning arrived with a sharper edge, not in the air itself, but in the way Ethan moved through it, his pace more deliberate, his focus more defined, as if the uncertainty from the night before had condensed into something actionable, something he could finally engage with. And yet beneath that control, something quieter remained, something that had begun to influence how he approached even the smallest decisions. The conference room was already prepared when he arrived, the glass walls reflecting the early light, the long table lined with documents, projections, expectations, and as the partner firm's representatives entered, their expressions carried that same measured professionalism. But now there was hesitation woven into it, subtle, but present, the kind that confirmed exactly what Amara had said, uncertainty. Ethan greeted them with his usual precision, his voice calm, controlled, giving nothing away, and as the meeting began, the conversation moved. Carefully, each side testing the ground beneath them, every word measured for impact, for implication, for advantage. And yet something about the rhythm felt different, not slower, not weaker, just altered. Amara sat beside him, silent, composed, her presence steady but unobtrusive, and though she did not speak, Ethan was aware of her in a way that went beyond proximity, as if her earlier words had shifted something in how he processed what unfolded around him. When the discussion reached its critical point, the hesitation from the other side became clearer, not in what they said, but in what they avoided saying, in the slight delays, the careful phrasing, the absence of commitment, and Ethan recognized it instantly, the pattern of someone who had not decided yet, someone waiting to see which direction would feel safer. And for a moment, his instinct pushed forward, the familiar approach, assert control, define the terms, close the gap before it widened. But just as he was about to speak, something held him back, not doubt, not uncertainty, but a pause, a shift, a consideration that had not existed before. He leaned back slightly instead, allowing the silence to stretch just a fraction longer, long enough to change the pressure in the room, long enough for the other side to feel it. And then, when he spoke, his tone was different, still controlled, still precise, but less forceful, more directed. "You are not ready to withdraw," he said, not as a question, not as an accusation, but as a statement grounded in observation, and the effect was immediate. The subtle tension across the table shifted, not broken, but acknowledged, and one of the representatives glanced at the other before responding. "We are evaluating our position." And there it was, the confirmation, the uncertainty made visible. Ethan nodded once, as if that was exactly what he expected, because now it was not something to react to, but something to work with, then evaluate it fully. He continued, his voice steady. "But do not confuse hesitation with strategy." And the words settled into the room with a quiet weight, not aggressive, not confrontational, but clear, and for the first time since the meeting began, the balance shifted, not dramatically, but enough to be felt. Beside him, Amara remained still, her gaze forward, but there was a subtle change in her posture, a slight ease, as if something had aligned with what she had already understood. The conversation continued, but now the direction had changed. The uncertainty no longer controlled the room. It had been reframed, and as the meeting concluded, the agreement was not finalized, but it was no longer drifting. It had direction again, and that alone was enough. When the room emptied and the door closed behind the last representative, the silence that followed felt different, not heavy, not uncertain, but resolved in a way Ethan had not anticipated. He stood for a moment, his hands resting lightly against the table, his mind replaying the shift, not just in the outcome, but in how he had arrived there. And slowly, he turned toward Amara, his expression thoughtful, less guarded than before. "You saw that before it happened," he said, not questioning, not doubting, just acknowledging. And she met his gaze, her expression unchanged. "It was already there," she replied. And again, the simplicity of her answer carried more weight than explanation ever could, because it meant something deeper than analysis, something closer to awareness. Ethan exhaled quietly, a faint shift in his posture signaling something internal, something adjusting. And as they stepped out of the conference room together, he realized something he had not fully admitted until that moment. This was no longer just about managing a situation or fulfilling an agreement. This was about understanding something he had not accounted for, something that could not be written into a contract. And as he glanced at her, walking beside him with that same steady presence, he felt it more clearly than before, that shift, that pull, that growing realization that her role in this arrangement had already become something far more significant than he had intended. And for the first time, he did not try to redefine it. He simply allowed it to exist. The city outside seemed quieter that evening, not because the noise had faded, but because something inside Ethan had shifted enough to make everything else feel distant, less immediate. And as the car carried them back through the slow rhythm of traffic, the glow of passing streetlights traced brief patterns across the glass, reflecting moments that felt both familiar and strangely altered. He did not speak at first, not out of habit, but because he was still processing something he could not reduce to numbers or outcomes, something that had followed him out of the conference room and into the silence beside him. Amara sat with the same calm presence, her posture relaxed, her gaze directed outward, but not lost, and that steadiness, that quiet certainty, had begun to carry weight in a way he could no longer ignore. "You knew they would hesitate," he said finally, his voice low, more reflective than analytical, and she turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze without tension. "I knew they had not decided," she replied, and again, the distinction mattered, because it removed assumption and replaced it with something clearer, something grounded. Ethan nodded once, absorbing that, not as a correction, but as an expansion of something he had not considered deeply enough before, and for a moment, the silence returned, but it felt different now, less empty, more shared. When they reached the penthouse, the transition from the outside world into the quiet interior felt sharper than usual, as if the space itself was responding to something unspoken, and as Ethan stepped inside, he paused just briefly, his hand resting against the back of a chair, grounding himself in the familiar structure of his environment, yet aware that it no longer felt exactly the same. Amara moved past him without hesitation, setting her bag aside before walking toward the window, the skyline stretching endlessly beyond, each light steady, each building fixed, and yet inside, nothing felt entirely fixed anymore. "You changed the outcome," Ethan said after a moment, his voice carrying less resistance now, more acknowledgement, and she did not turn immediately, allowing the statement to settle before responding. "No," she said quietly. "You did." And when she looked back at him, her expression held that same calm clarity, not dismissing his observation, but refining it, shaping it into something more accurate. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering for just a second before lifting again, because he understood what she meant, even if he had not fully accepted it yet. The shift had not come from her actions alone, but from how he had allowed himself to respond differently, to pause, to observe, to adjust, and that realization carried a weight he had not anticipated. "You influenced it," he said, not as a correction, but as a continuation, and this time, she gave a slight nod, not claiming ownership, not denying it, just acknowledging the connection. "Influence is not control," she replied, and the words settled into him with quiet precision, because they separated something he had always treated as the same, and in that separation, something else became possible. The evening unfolded without urgency, no immediate decisions to make, no external pressures demanding attention. But internally, something continued to move, to shift, to realign, and Ethan found himself watching her again, not with calculation, but with something closer to recognition, as if he were beginning to understand the role she played not just in the situation, but in him. "You do not ask for anything," he said after a while, the observation emerging without intention, and she tilted her head slightly, considering it. "There is nothing to ask for," she replied, and the simplicity of it made him pause, because it contradicted everything he had learned about value, exchange, expectation, and yet it did not feel incorrect, it felt complete. He stepped closer, stopping just within her space, not intruding, but no longer maintaining the distance he had once kept so carefully. "Everyone asks for something," he said, quieter now, less certain, and she met his gaze, steady as always. "Not everyone," she answered, and in that moment, the difference between them became clearer than it had ever been, not in status, not in power, but in perspective, in what they believed mattered and what they did not. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was full, layered with everything that had not been said, everything that did not need to be. And as Ethan stood there, looking at her, he felt something shift again, deeper this time. Not just awareness, not just curiosity, but something closer to reliance, something that unsettled him because it meant he was no longer entirely independent in the way he had always been, and that realization, quiet as it was, carried more weight than any decision he had made that day, because it was not about business, not about outcomes, it was about something personal, something he could not easily define or control. And as the city lights reflected in the glass behind her, he understood something he had been avoiding. Her presence was no longer just part of an arrangement. It had become part of how he moved through everything, and that made it irreplaceable in a way he had never intended. The days that followed did not announce themselves with change, but with consistency, a steady rhythm that should have felt predictable. Yet for Ethan, it no longer did, because something beneath that rhythm had shifted in a way he could not reverse. Meetings continued, decisions were made, the structure of his world remained intact, but the way he moved within it had begun to adjust, subtly at first, then more noticeably, and each adjustment traced back to the same quiet presence that had become impossible to ignore. That afternoon, the penthouse felt unusually still, the kind of stillness that came not from absence, but from awareness, and Ethan stood in his study, reviewing documents that required his attention. Yet his focus kept drifting, not outward, not toward distraction, but inward, towards something he had been avoiding naming. Across the room, through the open doorway, he could see Amara seated near the window, a book resting loosely in her hands, though she had not turned a page in several minutes. Her gaze directed outward, calm, steady, present, and there was something in that stillness that drew his attention more than movement ever could. He set the document aside, the sound soft but deliberate, and stepped into the main room, his pace slower than usual, not out of hesitation, but because he was no longer moving. Automatically, he was choosing each step, each moment. "You are not reading," he said, his voice low, more observational than questioning, and she shifted her gaze toward him, not surprised, not defensive, just aware. "No," she replied, closing the book gently and placing it beside her. "I am thinking." And the simplicity of that answer carried weight, because it did not attempt to redirect, it simply existed. Ethan nodded slightly, stepping closer, his eyes searching her expression as if looking for something he had not yet understood. "About what?" he asked, and she considered the question for a moment, not avoiding it, but not rushing to answer. "About what comes next," she said finally, and something in the way she said it, quiet but certain, shifted the air between them. Ethan's expression tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition, because the question of what came next had always been something he controlled, something he defined through planning, through structure, through decision. But now, hearing it framed so simply, so openly, it felt different, less like a strategy and more like a reality approaching. "That is already defined," he replied, his tone measured, returning to something familiar, something structured. "The terms are clear," and as the words left him, they felt more like repetition than conviction, something he had said before, something he was supposed to believe. And Amara watched him quietly, her gaze steady, not challenging, not dismissing, just present. "The terms define the end," she said, her voice calm, "not what happens before it." And again, the distinction landed with precision, because it exposed something he had not fully acknowledged, that everything unfolding between the beginning and the end had not been planned, had not been contained. Ethan exhaled slowly, his hand brushing lightly against the back of the chair beside him, grounding himself in something physical as his thoughts shifted. "And what do you think happens before it?" he asked, his voice quieter now, less certain, and she held his gaze, not with intensity, but with clarity. "That depends on whether you are still trying to control it," she replied, and the words settled into him with a weight that was difficult to ignore, because they did not accuse, they revealed. The silence that followed stretched longer this time, not uncomfortable, but full, layered with everything that had not been said directly, and Ethan found himself standing still, not because he lacked an answer, but because he was no longer sure which answer mattered. "Control is necessary," he said finally, though his voice lacked the certainty it once carried, and she nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth in that without accepting it completely. "Sometimes," she said, "but not always." And there it was again, that quiet expansion of something he had always treated as fixed, He looked at her for a moment longer, something shifting behind his expression, something less guarded, less defined, and when he finally spoke again, it was softer, more honest than anything he had said before. "You are changing more than the situation," he admitted, and for the first time, the statement carried no resistance, no attempt to correct it afterward, just acknowledgement. Amara did not respond immediately. She let the words settle, let them exist fully before answering. "No," she said gently. "I am not changing it." And when she met his gaze, there was something deeper there now, something that had grown quietly over time. "I am showing you what it already is." And the truth of that statement lingered between them, steady and undeniable, and as Ethan stood there, absorbing it, he realized something that shifted everything once again. This was no longer about whether the arrangement would end. That had always been certain. What mattered now was what had already happened within it, what had already changed, and whether he could return to the version of himself that existed before it began, and for the first time, he was not sure that he could. The realization did not arrive all at once. It came quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the gradual dimming of light at the end of the day, and yet once it settled, it could not be undone. The following morning carried a stillness that felt different from the ones before, not empty, not calm, but defined, as if something had reached a point where it could no longer remain unspoken, and Ethan felt it before he fully understood it. A shift in the air, in the space, in the way everything around him seemed to hold its breath. He stood in the main room, his hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, his gaze unfocused for just a moment, because for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about what needed to be done. He was thinking about what had already happened, about the changes he could not reverse, about the presence that had become part of everything without asking for permission. Behind him, Amara moved through the space with that same quiet precision. But there was something different now, not in her actions, but in the way he perceived them, each movement carrying a weight he had not assigned before, each moment defined not by what it was, but by what it meant. "You are leaving soon," he said, the words coming out before he had fully decided to speak them, and the room seemed to settle around that sentence, as if it had been waiting for it. Amara paused, her hand resting lightly against the back of a chair, and for a moment, she did not turn. She did not respond. She simply allowed the statement to exist, to take its place between them before acknowledging it. "Yes," she said finally, her voice calm, steady, unchanged, and that steadiness carried more weight than any hesitation would have, because it meant she had already accepted it, already moved through it in a way he had not. Ethan nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something he already knew, something he had always known, and yet now it felt different. Less like a condition and more like an outcome. Something real, something approaching. "The terms are almost complete," he added, his tone measured. But there was something beneath it now, something quieter, something less controlled, and Amara turned to face him fully, her gaze steady, not searching, not questioning, just present. "They were always going to be," she replied, and the simplicity of her words settled into him with a weight he could not ignore. Because they did not change anything. They only revealed what had been there. From the beginning, the silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with everything that had not been said, everything that had been avoided, and Ethan found himself standing still, not because he lacked words, but because the words he had were no longer sufficient, no longer aligned with what he felt. "You do not seem affected," he said after a moment, his voice lower now, more personal than before, and she studied him briefly, not analyzing, not challenging, just seeing. "I am," she said, and that single admission shifted something again, because it carried truth without display, without performance, just presence. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for just a second before lifting again, and in that moment, something in him shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to change how he stood, how he spoke, how he existed in that space. "Then why does it not show?" he asked, quieter now, and she held his gaze, her expression unchanged. "Because it does not need to," she replied, and the words landed with quiet certainty, because they removed the expectation of reaction, of visible proof, leaving only what was real beneath it. He looked at her for a long moment, something moving behind his expression, something deeper than thought. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, something he had not allowed before. "It matters," he said, not specifying what, not defining it, because he did not need to. And for the first time, the statement was not about control, not about structure. It was about acknowledgement. Amara did not respond immediately. She let the words settle, let them exist fully before answering. "I know," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, not soft, not distant, just certain, that made the moment feel complete in a way nothing else could. Outside, the city moved as it always did, lights shifting, people passing, time continuing without pause. But inside, something had reached a point of stillness, not because it had ended, but because it had been understood. And as Ethan stood there, facing her, he realized something he had not allowed himself to fully accept until now. This was not just an arrangement that was ending. It was something that had already changed him, something that would not leave when she did, something that would remain. And that realization carried a weight he could not measure, because for the first time, he was not thinking about how to control what came next. He was thinking about whether he was willing to let it go at all. The final morning did not feel like an ending, not in the way Ethan had always understood endings, not clean, not defined, not something that could be signed and filed away. It felt unfinished in a way that unsettled him, because for the first time in his life, something important did not follow structure, did not follow control. It simply existed beyond it. The sunlight entered the penthouse in long, quiet lines, touching the same surfaces it always had, but nothing about the space felt the same anymore, because he was not the same within it. And as he stood there, still, his gaze drifting across the room, he realized that the silence was no longer neutral. It carried memory now, presence, something that would remain even after she was gone. Behind him, the sound of a suitcase closing broke the stillness, soft but final, and he did not turn immediately, not because he did not want to, but because he understood that once he did, the moment would become real in a way he could know. Longer delay. When he finally faced her, Amara stood near the door, her posture calm, composed as always, but there was something different in the air between them, something heavier, something acknowledged without needing to be spoken. "Everything is complete," she said, her voice steady, not distant, not emotional, just clear, and the words landed with a weight that echoed through the space. Because they were true, the terms had been fulfilled, the time had passed, the agreement had reached its end exactly as it was meant to. Ethan nodded once, slowly, his hands at his sides, his posture still controlled, but the stillness carried something else now, something restrained, something held back. "Yes," he said, and for a moment, that was all there was, the confirmation of something that should have felt simple, but did not. Amara reached for her suitcase, her movements precise, unhurried, and as she stepped closer to the door, Ethan felt something shift, not in the room, but within himself, something tightening, something resisting the forward motion of what was supposed to happen next. "You are leaving without asking for anything," he said, the observation emerging before he could stop it, and she paused, her hand resting lightly on the handle, turning just enough to meet his gaze. "There is nothing left to ask for," she replied, and the calm certainty in her voice made it impossible to argue, because it was not about what could be given, it was about what had already been. Ethan took a step forward, the distance between them narrowing for the first time without hesitation, without calculation, and his gaze held hers, steady but no longer distant. "That is not true," he said, quieter now, more honest than he had allowed himself to be before, and the words hung there, not fully formed, not fully defined, but carrying everything he had not said until now. Amara did not move. She did not retreat. She simply watched him, waiting, not expecting, just present. And for a moment, the world outside the door, the city, the time, everything beyond that space seemed to fade, leaving only the truth that had been building between them from the beginning. Ethan exhaled slowly, his control still there, but no longer guiding him, no longer determining his next step. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, something unguarded. "I thought this would be simple," he admitted. "I thought it would begin and end without changing anything." And as the words left him, They felt less like a statement and more like a realization, something he had not fully understood until now. Amara listened, her expression unchanged, but her presence steady, grounding, and when he paused, she did not interrupt. She did not fill the silence. She allowed it to hold the weight of what was being said, but it did change something. He continued, his voice lower, more certain now. It changed how I see things, how I decide, how I move through everything. And there was no need to finish the thought, because the meaning was already clear, already present. The silence that followed was not empty. It was complete, filled with everything that had led to this moment, everything that had been understood without being spoken. And for the first time, Ethan did not try to control it. He did not try to define it. He simply allowed it to exist. Amara held his gaze for a moment longer, something softer beneath her calm, something real. And then she gave a slight nod, not as an agreement, not as a farewell, but as an acknowledgement of what had already been shared. Then it was not just a contract, she said, her voice quiet, but certain, and the truth of it settled into the space with a finality that did not close anything, but opened something else. Ethan did not respond immediately, because he knew she was right, and as he stood there, facing her, he understood that the decision in front of him was no longer about terms, no longer about structure. It was about whether he was willing to let something real leave simply because it was never meant to stay. And for the first time, he hesitated, not because he lacked clarity, but because he finally had it.